this question of the pulling and pushing that goes on at the frontier of imagination, at the boundary of what it's possible to think. One of the reasons for the pushing back, I think, is that we live in an age in which the gap between private life and the public sphere has never been so small. There used to be a much more substantial distance between private life and public life. And I mean, a demonstration of this is the career of Jane Austen, who writes her entire body of work, more or less contemporary with the Napoleonic Wars, without really feeling much need to tell us anything about the Napoleonic Wars, except that every so often soldiers show up at parties, looking nice in red uniforms. This is the role of the army in the body of work of Jane Austen, is to look cute at parties. And yet, when you read her books, you do not feel that she is in some way ducking a question, or that she is in some way failing to fully explain the lives of her characters. You know, she's obviously not doing that. And the reason is that at that time it was possible to wholly explain a human life while barely recognizing the public life of the period, that they seem to happen in separate compartments. You know, this is no longer true. And that goes a long way towards creating what one might call the surrealism of real life, the intrusion, the daily impact of gigantic events on private lives makes our lives much odder than they used to be, and makes the telling of stories about them, well, gives us new problems, let's say, in the telling of those stories, because even family life, even something which you might think is private and behind closed doors, like family life, is now impacted by the way in which the world moves. You know, speaking of family life, I think it's very interesting to see how one of the things that happens in families is a proof of the need for storytelling in the world, because we are what I call storytelling animals. You know, as far as one can tell, there is no other species on the planet that uses the act of telling a story in order to understand something about themselves. If there is a great dolphin literature, I look forward to seeing it, but so far the Tolstoy of the dolphins has not emerged. We, on the other hand, constantly narrate ourselves to each other. And I'm not even talking about writers now. I'm talking about all of us as private citizens. Inside a family, one of the most obvious facts about a family is that a family has family stories. And that when you are in a family, you know those stories. And many of those stories are a little suspect, and you don't always tell them to outsiders. But when people join the family, either when a child is born or somebody marries in or whatever may happen, gradually those new arrivals are filled in. You know, they get told the family stories, and when they know the family stories, they are fully members of the family. So stories become a way in which we define our kinship as well, and also, you know, when we die, we turn into one of those stories, perhaps. We become one of the stories that people tell, you know, and this is why it seems to me stories are what remain of us in the end. And that's why it's always seemed to me the reason why stories are important, the reason why the telling of stories, the making of stories is important, is not just that it gives me a job and it, you know, it's important for me to be able to shoot my mouth off or whatever. It's because this has a deep connection to our most fundamental nature as human beings. It is very, very deeply connected to the kind of creatures that we are. You know, and that's a reason for defending the stuff and protecting it. It's not just, you know, to give writers the luxury to sound off. It's because this is the kind of thing we are, and that nothing else on the planet is like, the tellers of stories. There are problems to do with this, which were a little bit hinted at in the introduction, so I just thought I'd go a little bit more into this. The question of autobiography. It's increasingly the case that people believe these days that the best way to understand what a writer is saying and writing is to know as much as possible about the writer's life. Novels are autobiographies in disguise. This is fed, of course, this whole idea is fed by the fact that writers now come and stand up here and explain their work and talk about the origins and what happened to them as children and so on. So it is partly we who are to blame for this. And of course there is an element of truth in it, because of course, nothing comes from nowhere, and writers have lives, and their lives are their experience, and their experience is transmuted into fiction. All that's true. However, there are often cases where autobiography is not at all a useful explanation for a piece of work. I mean, for example, Nabokov was not a child molester, nor did he, as far as we know, commit any murders. And how disappointing this must be to the students of the autobiographical mode when they're reading Lolita, and assume that it must be an autobiography in disguise. I was talking to what we must now call the writer Steve Martin the other day, and his new novel is about somebody with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And he said that most of the journalists who interviewed him said, "So are you like this at all?" And when he said no, he wasn't, they clearly did not believe him. My last novel, Fury, is about a man who is sexually abused as a child, dressed up in women's clothing, grows up to be, in a way, the victim of a terrible rage that he can barely control, almost murders his sleeping wife and child, flees to America and becomes subject to strange blackout rages, during the course of which he suspects that he may be, in fact, committing a series of serial murders of young girls. And when the book came out, journalists said to me, "So is it autobiographical?" So I just thought I'd offer you, in case of budding writers in the audience, both the wrong and the right answer to this question. The wrong answer unfortunately happens to be the truth, but that doesn't save it. The wrong answer is that, of course, there are little bits that come from your life and experience, and you join that up with things you found out elsewhere, and then you make up some things, and you stick them all together and shuffle it around, and you offer what is in the end a work of fiction. This is the wrong answer. Do not give this answer. The correct answer is, it's completely autobiographical. Everything that happens in this book happened either to myself or to close friends or family members. When the Martian comes in the bedroom window and rapes the grandmother, my grandmother. Right? This is the reason this is the right answer is that it is the only answer that will persuade the journalist to ask the next question.